Camphor Smell. In a way, it almost didn't even matter what was showing. There was almost a romanticism to it just being whatever it was, you know? I think I used that word too much, or too broadly at least. Everything's romantic. Not picking a specific movie to go see, but rather having a standing weekly date with capital T, the capital M movies, loving something that much, and having something that worth loving, trusting Hollywood to put out something worth 2 hours of my life on any random Tuesday. That's romantic. These days, I'm not so sure that bargain's being upheld. And holding on to something you used to love past the point of reason is only romantic up to a point. At a certain point, it just becomes sad. I hadn't been to a theater in many months, but at the rate things were going, if I just chanced it, it seemed likely that I'd be eating it in a Roblox movie or Avengers 6. Sometimes I worry that I am becoming too cynical. Somewhere between the murky cloud of the idea emerging from the miasma of my subconscious and getting in my Nissan Altima to drive to the theater, I realized that it could never be The Graduate. It could never be anything so pithy and iconic as Back to the Future 2. Not on cosmic chance, not unless I hand-picked it. And the idea of hand-picking a movie to kill myself in, for any reason, pun, biographical, political, was unthinkably twee. It was just going to be at the movies, at a place that has brought me so much happiness over the years and felt so much like home, which is why I was driving almost an hour one way back to Brunswick, to the theater I'd attended as a child. I was shocked when I Googled The Diamond and found it listed at all, let alone, apparently, still in operation. It didn't say still on Google. My family moved away from Brunswick when I was in 7th grade. Even back then, I remember hearing my parents make comments around other adults about how it was going downhill. A pretty rosy assessment looking back at it. Quainter times. When I went to East Brunswick, they could afford to run the heat all winter. The teachers were, as far as I knew, always paid on time. Nobody knew what was coming. How could they? Factories closed, jobs dried up, a classic American story. School burned down in a failed insurance fraud gambit. Between 2005 and 2015, Brunswick underwent the biggest collapse in standard of living of any city not directly affected by the Civil War in a 10-year period in the history of the United States. The parking lot was 3 blocks from the theater. In between were mostly empty storefronts and crumbling facades. An ample amount of garbage and graffiti, too. Newspapers blowing across the streets, potholed and salt-washed. Little piles of dirt and snow half-melted and refrozen a dozen times over along the edges of the sidewalks. I assumed to anyone else it just looked like any other post-industrial wasteland, but I spotted certain details. The stone lions guarding the bank, the turret tower with the spire roof on the building across from the library, that ripped through the grime and decay and revealed plainly what it had once been, what it still was in my memory, and it almost made me want to cry. I hadn't been back downtown to Brunswick proper since a concert during my college years. It was the last time I ever remembered hearing about anything like that happening there, any sort of event or social gathering. The street with all the bars and clubs was only a couple of blocks over. It was on the news a couple of years ago when one of the music joints that had been built out and filled up way past code caught fire the night before Christmas and 15 people died. Now it was silent. You hear about people still from Brunswick now and again, but you never seem to meet them. I walked the long way around to go past the sandwich shop where we always used to eat in the summer when they put tables out on the sidewalk. Their Oreo milkshakes were the yardstick against which all other desserts of my childhood were measured. It was a cell phone store. There were cages over the windows. It didn't look like it had been open in several years. Someone was sleeping in the vestibule in front of the door. I could see the glow of the marquee before I turned the corner. I panicked momentarily at the last second thought that they might have changed that too. But they hadn't. There it stood, as if none of the years had passed between us. An outpost of civilization on the surface of the moon. The diamond double screen, burning electric against the night and the emptiness and time itself. Its yellow and red looking like something beamed down from an alien planet into a world of blue and gray nights and burnt beige concrete days. It read, "Na Showig," but was blank otherwise. I crossed the street. The box office was dark. There was a little sign hanging in the window that said to buy tickets inside at the concession stand. I cupped my hands to the glass. I had always thought that it looked so homey inside. The frosted glass, the neon. I ran my fingers over the green marble. There was a window near the kitchen table in our old house that looked out on the front walkway, and I used to sit at dinner and pretend I was working at the box office selling tickets. It was darker inside than I'd expected a public place to be. I was still waiting for my eyes to adjust when I realized that there was someone at the register. I'd been starting to wonder if I was alone. I was already approaching her when I realized that I didn't even know what movie I was going to see, and I didn't see any showtimes listed anywhere. I was a bit in my own head over this, and could barely make out any details on her still, even at such a close distance. Only snapped out of it when I heard her breathing. Very fast, very sharp exhales, inhales like she was trying to windburn the insides of her nostrils. Almost instinctively, I took a step back, and almost immediately I noticed her breathing slowed. Still audible, but less panicked. "Hi," I said, and her breathing went right back up. I took another step back. She slowed. I stepped back again. It returned to nearly normal, a bit deeper maybe, like she was consciously trying to calm herself down. I looked left and right, Theater A and Theater B. "Popcorn?" I asked from where I was standing. There was a long exhale. I don't know how she could have had so much breath in her lungs. Then a long silence. Then she went back into the room behind the counter, and a few seconds later she came out, and some lanky, greasy guy with swoopy hair over his eyes followed her out and filled a bucket of popcorn for me. He left it on the counter and disappeared back into the back room. And when I tried to approach the register to pay for the popcorn, she sounded like she might take off if I ever got close enough to hand her my card, so I just took it and went into Theater B. I stopped just inside the doorway and remembered why I was there, and felt ridiculous being chased inside like that. But what else was I gonna do? Go to the other one out of spite? I didn't see how that was any better. Either way, it seemed like decent odds that she would be the one to find me. That thought held me there a minute longer. It wasn't something I'd even considered. I mean, she was still as good as a stranger, I guess. I didn't even know the color of her hair. Some sort of dark chestnut, I think. But any old stranger will do is very different from, how about this one? I stood in the dark hallway thinking. I supposed that we all would have to be a burden to someone somewhere at some point eventually, no matter how self-sufficient and unbothersome we strove to be in life. As part of the contract, whether it be a loved one, an unlucky hiker looking for shelter out in the remote wilderness, or the poor girl working the register at the theater at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. We're 2/3 liquids. It can't be helped. I knew a guy once who claimed that his cousin worked for a company cleaning up the apartments of dead people. He said the work was absolutely foul anytime someone went undiscovered for more than a few days. I heard someone breathing, so loud I thought it had to have been right in my ear. I opened the door. 2 people, fully nude and 25 feet tall, fucking on screen. There were maybe half a dozen pale faces scattered about the audience, awash in their light. All of them were looking at me. I returned to the lobby. There was nobody behind the counter. Out front, the guy who'd handed me my popcorn was smoking a cigarette. I asked him if they were a porno theater. Theater B, weeknights after 11. I used to come here as a kid, I said. I don't know why, I never made small talk with strangers, and he hadn't even looked at me when he'd spoken. That sucks, he said. Do you know what's in Theater A? I couldn't believe he wasn't wearing a jacket. He finally looked at me. Under the strange angle of the street lamp shadows, I thought that he was purely annoyed with me, but then I realized he was smiling. The craziest shit you've ever seen, he said. He flicked his butt into the wind. None of the cars that were parked along the street looked drivable. He started to laugh, and it turned into a coughing fit. Nah, man, I don't know. Some art house crap. The projectionist is a pretty out there dude. He programs the midnight block. I hadn't smoked a cigarette since my big drinking days back in college. I only smoked when I drank, and I only drank a minimum of 4 nights a week back then. But asked him if I could bum one, envisioning blindfolded revolutionaries going to the wall. He let me. I had the sense that he didn't see too many sociable types out here. He cupped his red hand, covered in dead skin, to block the wind, and lit it for me, and I took a drag and thanked him. I turned the bottle over in my jacket pocket, felt the pills tumble around. They say that men and women attempt suicide at the same rate, and men only succeed more. They say it's because we use more efficient methods, but the violence of putting a gun to my head just made my stomach turn. I was going out like an old-time Hollywood starlet, washed up at 28. Too bad my apartment wasn't glamorous enough for a clawfoot tub. On the way back, I grabbed a box of mints from behind the counter and dumped them into my popcorn. The girl was nowhere to be found, so I kept my eye on the door to the back and filled a soda, and then I went into the bathroom and swallowed like 15 of the pills. I expected to see about as many faces in Theater A gawking back at me as I had in B, looking like the type of fish you find in the dark part of the ocean when you start flipping over rocks. Perverts of a different stripe, alternative tastes and fetishes, probably an equivalent ratio of spectacles. But from what I could discern in the darkness, Theater A was just about packed to the gills. There was nothing on screen, so I could not see where everyone was looking, but I certainly felt observed. I could see the outline of row after row of heads by the barest glow from the projection booth. My heart started racing. I could hear a clock ticking in my head. I envisioned turning around, dropping like a housefly somewhere in the lobby or parking lot, or just passing out in my car. I had to take a breath to steel myself. Had to have some resolve. It wasn't the mostly empty theater I'd envisioned, but nothing in life is ever exactly the way you picture it. Why should death be any different? I wandered up the stairs, only wishing to nod off without drooling on some poor stranger's shoulder. As my eyes adjusted enough to navigate the steps, I took a look at the people I was passing. They were all dressed somewhat formally, though stodgily might be a better word. It wasn't the usual midnight movie crowd. All of the people that I could see looked to be over 50. A lot of stuffy suits and modest dresses, looking like an autumn funeral. The last couple of rows were mercifully mostly empty. I squeezed past a few sets of knees, whispering apologies, and settled into a spot in the corner. There might have been 100 people in there, and nobody was even whispering. I checked my watch. It was 11 minutes to midnight. I waited patiently. Normally, I tried to hold off on eating any popcorn until the movie started in earnest. Sometimes I succeeded. Mostly I failed. Sometimes I finished a small popcorn before the trailers were over. I felt that everyone in Theater A would have heard every kernel squeak against my teeth if I had tried to eat any then, and it was not difficult to hold off. I drank my soda in silence. 5 minutes to midnight, a spotlight appeared on the corner of the stage in front of the screen. There was a microphone. At midnight, the curtain fluttered a bit, but nobody appeared. A minute later, the spotlight flipped off. A few seconds after that, the screen flickered to life. Through the wall, I could hear someone coughing up a lung in the projection booth. Cigarette smoke wafting out the little window. After a few funny-looking titles that I squinted at but couldn't read, was my mind already going? The movie started. The screen was filled with a blue sky and a green field and a hazy, almost ethereal golden light. A little house situated by a brook beneath a tree. A narrator started speaking Russian. The titles had been in Cyrillic. I waited for subtitles, but they never came. There was a woman in peasant clothes, standing with her arms crossed by the gate to the little house, her hair and all the grass blowing in the wind. Something about her face made my heart sing. Her children, or children I presumed were hers, appeared over a gentle rise. I couldn't understand anything that was happening, but there was a rhythm to it. Gradually, I began to pick up on some of the main currents, who the main characters were, or seemed to be. It all moved more like a poem than a film. My ideas were constantly undercut the second that they started to seem solid. For the first 15 minutes, I thought a girlfriend was a sister, and the people seemed to be changing age almost every scene. But it carried me forward. I cared about what would happen next, though I couldn't have told you why, and probably still can't. It was like a painting come to life. I felt as if I'd lived an entire lifetime in that little farmhouse with all those people. It felt both real and bigger than real, like I was participating in some archetypal ritual, more like receiving memories embedded deep in my DNA than witnessing something foreign or other. Before I knew what was happening, I was crying. It started as misty eyes, but wasn't long before I was on the verge of sobbing, looking at my one aisle mate halfway across the theater to see if he was staring at me, but he didn't seem to have heard anything, or was being very discreet if he had. I didn't speak a word of Russian yet. I was thinking of my own mother and my own childhood. Maybe it was the rush of emotion, but soon I was exhausted. It was a quieter, slower sort of movie, and during certain passages I began nodding off in my seat. I was enraptured with the movie. I wanted to give it my full attention, but no matter what I tried, or how hard I focused, my mind constantly drifted. Every few seconds my eyes began to flutter shut, and every time it took me longer and longer to open them again. I was trying to remember how early I'd woken up that morning, why I might be so tired. I was a perpetual night owl. When I remembered all of the sleeping pills I'd swallowed not so long ago. That gave me a temporary jolt of alertness. My heart pounded. I didn't want to go through with this. If nothing else, I wanted to see the end of the movie. There was something to stick around for, at least for another hour, though I had a sneaking suspicion that at the end of the hour I'd decide to re-up for at least a few more, if I made it that far. Things were stirring in my chest, aching even. Things I had forgotten were there, or thought I'd lost when I was 20. I looked down the aisle. I'd have to interrupt the movie to shuffle past the one guy. What the hell was this movie? I recognized one of the voices, and I realized that I could understand it. They were speaking English. The house on screen was no longer a weather-worn Slavic farmhouse. It was a modern house with beige carpet and lazy boys and sliding glass doors. It was my house, my family's house where I'd grown up. My mother was speaking, evidently from behind the camcorder. A sled, still dripping with half-melted snow, was sitting on the linoleum just inside the door. The camera swung and zoomed in on the couch. There I was, no more than 7 or 8 years old, asleep, with my arms wrapped around my little sister, asleep in my lap, her head rolled over. She was wearing a bandage above her right eye. We'd been out playing in the snow, and I had become frustrated by my inability to pack a snowball that would stay in one piece when it left my hand. I grabbed a frozen street hockey ball that had probably been laying in its spot in the garden since the previous winter and packed snow around it. I stepped around the corner when I heard my sister coming and winged it at her. She went down right away, and I knew by the sound it had made that it was bad. I still remember her pink and purple neon snowsuit laying starfish in between the trees, the way the snow clouds in the early evening sky reflected back every single light in the city nearby as a dull amber glow. I carried her back to the house on the sled. He thought he killed her, said my mom from 30 years in the past. Enough. I needed at least more time to consider, more time to... I squeezed past the guy without even apologizing, took the steps down 2 at a time. I could hear my dad coming home from work, coming in the room behind me as I exited the theater. Christ, was he trying to kill her? He said. Christmas lights glowing beneath the fresh snow, the big bulbs, red, yellow, green, and blue. When I was even littler, we'd go to the edge of the neighborhood and wait, and he'd put me on his lap and let me drive the rest of the way home. I went straight to the bathroom and huddled down in the first stall. I had never made myself throw up before. I wasn't sure if I could. I hit a heavy gag, and then another, and then something came up. I counted a few of the pills floating in the toilet. Maybe half, if I was lucky. I tried again, but only drew dry heaves. I felt better, though. I sat on the disgusting tile for several minutes, taking stock of my body, of my stomach, examining the tar and the grout, the Sharpie on the stall wall. I was less drowsy. I felt lighter. I pulled myself to my feet and gargled water at the sink. There was a dark-haired woman sitting at the small bar on the far side of the lobby. There was something familiar about the arch of her back, the way she leaned on her elbows. It was Sarah Gray, my high school girlfriend. I sat a few stools to her left and ordered a 7-Up. She recognized me immediately. Not drinking these days? She asked. I shook my head. I actually just tried to kill myself, I said. I could feel her looking at me. Same stupid sense of humor, she said. I'm not joking. I finished the 7-Up and ordered another. I changed my mind, though. She asked if I shouldn't see a doctor. I shrugged. I'm probably fine. What else could they do for me anyways? Besides, I want to see the end of the movie. She eyed the door to the theater. I heard the director was here to introduce the film. Some Eastern European guy, right? Molly wrote something about it for the school paper. Her daughter. I said that he wasn't here. The bartender spoke up and said that he was. He'd served him earlier that evening. He said he'd had a premonition in a dream. If he attended the screening, he would die within a week. He felt it in his bones. Those were the words he used. Sarah took a cigarette from her purse and lit it. It smelled so strong that for a brief second I thought I was going to throw up again. I didn't know you smoked, I said. That's because, she said, putting her lighter away, you don't know me. She blew the smoke in my face with a grin. I finished the soda and paid. I still felt almost drunk on the thrill of having not died. I should have just married you, I said. I saw Sarah's eyes go wide, and she looked down at the bar and took a big sip of her drink. That sounded worse than I meant it, I said. It had been nearly 2 years since my fiance had left me. That was no longer a sharp, acute, minute-to-minute pain. That was not the capital R reason I had attempted this. It had long ago slipped back into the dreary melange of it all. That was the reason, as much as last month's credit card bill was. What I mean is just... She touched my arm. I know what you mean, she said. Would you have? Her face was older, but her eyes were the same, every bit. Probably, she said with a sympathetic smile. The little hallway back into the theater was so dark that I nearly ran into someone standing there. It didn't help that he was certainly less than 5 feet tall, maybe even nearer to 4, wearing tailcoats. And now that I saw him, I heard him too, muttering. I was about to move past him to the door when he spit at it. I turned to make sure he wasn't spitting at me, but he hadn't yet noticed me. He was making some kind of priestly-looking gesture with his hands, and his eyes were closed in concentration. His lips were mouthing something, and they were far too wet. His skin was pockmarked, and his cheeks were like T-bone slabs, his hair thinning on top. His head was stretching his glasses to their limits. I tried to parse what he was saying, and didn't even recognize the language. I was about to turn for the door when he opened his eyes. They were bloodshot and surprised to see me. If you'd given me an hour to respond, I never would have said what I said. But stuck there, between this man and the door handle that I could not seem to find, for some unearthly reason, I said, "Movie magic, huh?" He studied me, skeptical, but after a second I watched this demented smile come into his features. In his eyes, I watched him make up his mind about me. His lip curled and he said, "More than you know." I was halfway up the stairs when I looked ahead and saw my row more than half full. I looked around like there might be some misunderstanding afoot, but it was the final row. It was hard to mistake it. There was only one wrong theater I could have been in, and a cursory glance at the screen assured me that I was not. 3/4 of the way up, I looked ahead and realized that my own seat had, in fact, been filled in my absence. A couple steps after that, during a particularly bright shot, I realized that it was being filled by me. I was in the chair, slumped with puke glistening on the front of my shirt. My neck ached. I looked to see if anyone was looking at me. Nobody was. There was nobody standing up in the aisle either. My mouth was dry. I had no idea how much time was left in the movie or what was happening. Had I been sleeping? I tried to blink away the haziness but could not. The family were back at the farmhouse and there was a fire happening somewhere off screen, but it all felt very surreal because none of them were even acknowledging it. I shuffled my way down the row, puke stain facing the screen, whispering apologies every few seats. I hesitated at the door, but there was nobody on the other side. Nobody behind the counter either in the lobby. It was even darker than before, and the chairs were upside down on the bar. Maybe it really had been a dream. I began orienting myself accordingly and headed for the bathroom to clean up. I was standing at the sink when I became suddenly and intensely aware of the fact that I was not alone. I don't know how, but a minute later, a loud, echoing snort came from the stall behind me. The door opened and there stood the man from the hall outside the theater, still in his tailcoats. His nose had been powdered, and he looked at me with wide eyes. His face in the fluorescent light bordered on the grotesque, patches of red and dead skin across his forehead, a bulbous, scabby nose, various shades of yellow and green, the twisted gray hairs emerging from his ears, the lines in his forehead like canyons. He smiled at me. "You're missing the last reel," he said. I ran out of the bathroom and then out of the theater entirely without slowing down. I crossed the street and spent a few minutes just breathing, just feeling the cold air passing through my lungs. I watched the door, but it never opened. I considered going back inside to catch the ending, but just the thought of crossing the street brought that nauseous feeling roaring back, so I walked back to my car instead. The windows were frosted over. I closed the door behind me and sat in the silence with my ears ringing. They spent thousands of hours perfecting the exact sound a car door makes when it closes, and I'd never been so comforted by a noise in all my life. I wondered how long my car would have sat there, empty. I'd left it expecting never to return, and there I was. Like coming home from the airport after you've missed your flight. I was about to start it when I heard sirens coming up fast behind me. It didn't take long for them to get loud. Inside of 30 seconds, 2 fire engines were racing past the parking lot. They stopped in front of the theater and a half dozen men jumped out and went to work. The papers would have it the next morning. A fire in Theater A. 92 dead. Someone had barred the doors shut. Every last audience member burned alive. The fire crews managed to contain the spread before it could jump to another building, but the theater was condemned the next day. I haven't been back to Brunswick or the movies since.